Picture the past 3 days like a political earthquake ripping through Washington's marble floors. The kind of jolt no one expected, not even insiders who spend their lives reading power like weather patterns. Judges removed at a pace never witnessed in modern history. Federal departments forced to cough up data they've kept tucked away for years, maybe decades. Long ignored scandals involving SNAP fraud, foreign-linked welfare abuse, immigration loopholes, and bureaucratic failures, suddenly exposed under the brightest spotlight imaginable. And far from being random swings, these moves appeared deliberate, pieces of a puzzle being locked into place by a president, determined to reclaim the machinery of the federal government. Critics scream dictatorial, while supporters say finally. But here's the twist no one planned for. These actions are synchronized. They're methodical. They're aimed at reshaping the core structures that control how America actually functions. The courts, the agencies, the oversight mechanisms, the digital information networks. Today's analysis breaks down exactly what Trump has set in motion, how each action connects to the next, and why people inside D.C. are whispering that this may be the most sweeping reconfiguration of executive authority since the Cold War. This moment isn't just big, it's foundational. Before we get lost in headlines about firings, lawsuits, subpoenas, and executive orders, we need to stop and recognize something essential. None of this erupted out of thin air. For years, Americans have watched the federal system malfunction like an aging machine, long overdue for a complete rebuild. Immigration slowed to a crawl as court dockets backed up with cases spanning years. Welfare programs ballooned in cost while oversight lagged behind the swelling demand. Border security faltered, turning once clear rules into blurry suggestions. Picture owning a home and noticing a small stain on your ceiling. You patch it and walk away, but the stain grows, the drywall sags, and eventually you discover the pipes behind the wall have been leaking for years. At some point, patching isn't enough. The entire plumbing system needs replacement. That's where America found itself. Too many leaks, too many patches, too much denial. President Trump didn't randomly stumble into this moment. His administration spent years gathering evidence, cataloging inefficiencies, studying the data, and building the legal justification for an overhaul. What's happening now isn't spontaneous chaos. It's the execution phase of a long-prepared plan. That brings us to the first thunderclap Washington never saw coming, the removal of more than 100 immigration judges in just a matter of weeks. Not reassigned, not suspended, not quietly relocated, terminated. In New York alone, over a dozen judges received abrupt dismissal notices. San Francisco saw even higher numbers. Some courts lost a quarter of their judicial staff in a single sweep. This wasn't bureaucratic cleanup. This was a purge. And the question on everyone's mind was immediate. Can a president even do that? Aren't judges independent? Here's the crucial detail. Mainstream outlets conveniently skipped. Immigration judges are not Article III federal judges. But look at the resumes they wanted. Immigration enforcement backgrounds, military justice experience, federal prosecution. What was noticeably absent? Experience defending immigrants. When journalists reviewed the profiles of newly appointed judges, they found something striking. None, not one, had a history working on the defense or advocacy side of immigration law. Every single one came from the enforcement side. Activists immediately sounded alarms, warning that a court staffed entirely by former ICE agents, federal prosecutors, and military officers could not possibly remain neutral. They argued asylum hearings would turn into conveyor belts for deportation. But supporters countered with a harsh truth: the old system had collapsed. Backlogs were measured not in months or years, but decades. Fraud bubbled through every layer. America needed a judiciary that prioritized order, not loopholes. The administration's reasoning was blunt. When a system is drowning, you don't hire lifeguards who debate policy. You hire lifeguards who pull people out of the water. The previous court model allowed cases to linger for years, open to manipulation, inconsistent rulings, and endless appeals. Judges sympathetic to certain narratives granted asylum in cases where the evidence barely met thresholds. Meanwhile, millions of pending cases created a shadow population of individuals living in the U.S. indefinitely before ever seeing a courtroom. Trump's new hires were selected to reverse this trend. The priority was simple: speed, clarity, enforcement. Critics argued that such a shift compromised fairness. Supporters responded that fairness requires timely decisions too, and the old courts failed catastrophically at that. Whether one sees the new deportation judges as heroes restoring order or as enforcers eroding judicial independence depends largely on political perspective. But one fact remains inarguable. The immigration court system has undergone a transformation deeper than anything seen in modern memory. And that transformation is unfolding far faster than opponents can organize resistance. But judges were only the beginning. The next battle moved straight into the arteries of government funding. Enter SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, one of America's largest welfare programs, supporting tens of millions nationwide. For years, investigators raised concerns about fraud, duplicate benefits, phantom recipients, foreign nationals receiving funds illegally, deceased individuals mysteriously kept on active rolls. Trump's administration finally decided to confront the problem head-on. Through the Department of Agriculture, they demanded detailed records from every state, not just totals, specific names, addresses, social security numbers, immigration statuses, and benefit histories. States receiving federal dollars were expected to verify eligibility, but the request ignited immediate political warfare. Conservative-led states largely complied. Liberal-led states, California, New York, Minnesota, and others, flatly refused. Their justification, privacy concerns, and fear that the data would be weaponized to intimidate immigrant communities. Advocacy groups echoed the concern, accusing Trump of using welfare oversight as a hidden form of immigration enforcement. The administration's response was brutal in its simplicity: comply or lose funding. That triggered lawsuits, injunctions, emergency hearings, and heated constitutional debates. But beneath the chaos lay the real question: can states deny oversight for programs paid for by federal taxpayers? The administration argued that any program funded with federal dollars must be subject to federal verification. Otherwise, oversight becomes symbolic, a facade rather than a functional safeguard. If states could refuse transparency whenever politically convenient, fraud would multiply unchecked. Opponents countered that releasing personal data could create fear among immigrants, discouraging them from seeking help even when legally eligible. But one detail complicated their argument: fraud wasn't hypothetical, it was documented, recurring, and widespread. States that resisted audits had some of the highest benefit expenditures and some of the loosest verification systems. The administration insisted that taxpayers deserved accountability. Just as Social Security requires verification and Medicare demands documentation, SNAP should be no different. The showdown became less about food stamps and more about the nature of federal authority. If states administering federal programs can refuse compliance, then oversight cannot exist. What followed was a constitutional brawl over the limits of executive power, states' rights, and the mechanics of federal funding. But while the courtroom battles raged, investigators uncovered even more disturbing patterns in places like Minnesota. Fraud so astonishing in scale that it shocked even seasoned auditors. Minnesota became the epicenter of one of the largest welfare fraud scandals in U.S. history. An interconnected network of scams involving exaggerated daycare claims, phantom children, falsified receipts, illegal SNAP exchanges, housing fraud, and identity manipulation. Many of the implicated organizations operated within or around Somali immigrant communities. And before anyone jumps to conclusions, it's crucial to emphasize this was not about ethnicity, race, or religion. It was about accountability. Investigations revealed a stunning level of coordinated deception, with estimates ranging from hundreds of millions to over $1 billion in fraudulent claims. When Trump highlighted the scandal during a press conference, he didn't hold back. He blasted Minnesota's leaders for ignoring years of warnings from auditors and whistleblowers. He criticized Representative Ilhan Omar by name, arguing that political considerations prevented necessary scrutiny. Minneapolis community leaders responded with outrage, accusing Trump of demonizing immigrants, invoking painful historical comparisons and inflaming tensions. They argued that isolated cases of misconduct were being used to smear entire communities. But buried beneath the accusations was an undeniable reality. The fraud was real, the failures were real, and the cost, to taxpayers and to legitimate recipients, was staggering. What made the Minnesota scandal so explosive wasn't just the money lost, it was the years of warnings ignored. State employees flagged odd patterns. Daycares claiming full attendance when parking lots were empty. SNAP cards exchanged for cash in parking lots, tax filings that didn't match reported income, welfare recipients traveling overseas for months while still collecting benefits. Whistleblowers came forward, audits raised red flags. And yet, political leaders hesitated to act. Why? Fear of backlash, fear of being labeled discriminatory, fear of alienating a voting bloc. That hesitation allowed fraudulent networks to expand, siphoning resources from families who genuinely needed assistance. Trump's rhetoric may have been harsh, but his underlying argument struck a chord. A government that refuses to investigate fraud out of political fear is failing its citizens. The tragedy here is that the vast majority of law-abiding immigrants were unfairly associated with the actions of a few. But the deeper tragedy is how political timidity enabled criminal activity to flourish unchecked. Minnesota wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a national problem, a system so riddled with loopholes and so shielded by political sensitivities that fraud became almost effortless. Zooming out, investigators found the issue wasn't confined to welfare programs or isolated states. Fraud was rampant across federal agencies. The Small Business Administration's pandemic relief became a goldmine for scammers. Non-existent companies received enormous loans, applicants padded employee counts, and luxury purchases replaced payroll expenditures. Social Security saw payments sent to deceased individuals for years, with relatives quietly cashing checks. Disability claims soared, many supported by forged medical records or fabricated conditions. Immigration fraud grew equally problematic. Individuals entered the country under false identities, filed asylum claims based on rehearsed stories, and vanished into the interior before their hearings. Some operated under multiple identities across multiple states. The unifying factor across these cases was systemic failure. Federal databases weren't integrated. State systems didn't communicate. Verification processes lagged behind technological advancements by decades. This allowed the same individuals to exploit multiple programs simultaneously without detection. The scale of abuse reached levels previously unimaginable. But what's even more alarming is that, in many cases, these loopholes weren't just overlooked. They were protected by political resistance to reform. Imagine running a bank where loan applicants don't need verification, no ID checks, no income confirmation, no cross-referencing, just forms and trust. That bank would collapse instantly. Yet, that's strikingly similar to how federal programs operated. Massive budgets combined with minimal oversight. Some politicians quietly benefited from the chaos. A bloated welfare state created dependency, and dependency created predictable voting patterns. Tightening oversight risked backlash. Leaving the system loose maintained political stability. Reform proposals were attacked as heartless or discriminatory, even when aimed strictly at verifying eligibility. The result was a bureaucracy so large and so fragmented that fraud didn't just slip through the cracks, it walked through the front door. Trump's approach represented a direct confrontation with this status quo. Not just plugging leaks, but rebuilding the entire structure. But reforming welfare and immigration oversight wasn't enough. Trump wanted to address the obstacles preventing long-term change, specifically the structural roadblocks inside Congress. And that's what led him to one of his most controversial positions yet, eliminating the Senate filibuster. The filibuster, long viewed as a tool for forcing bipartisan cooperation, became the next target of Trump's reform strategy. He argued that America's political paralysis on immigration, on spending, on national security stemmed from a legislative branch incapable of decisive action. Eliminating the filibuster would allow major reforms to pass with simple majorities, empowering the executive branch to implement long-promised changes. Supporters agreed, arguing that Democrats had already signaled their willingness to abolish the filibuster when it served their interests. Why should Republicans cling to norms the opposition openly planned to discard? Critics, including some conservatives, warned the move could unleash future abuses. A future Democratic majority could pass sweeping, irreversible legislation, court packing, statehood expansions, massive regulatory overhauls, without any minority party input. Trump countered that America was past the point of procedural niceties. With borders overwhelmed, welfare systems exploited, and congressional dithering at historic levels, decisive action was essential. Eliminating the filibuster wasn't about expanding power, it was about restoring functionality. Whether brilliant or dangerous depends on perspective. But one thing is certain, Trump's willingness to challenge institutional guardrails marked a turning point in how executive power is interpreted. Some Treasury officials and advisors echoed Trump's sentiments, arguing that America faced crises demanding swift and centralized action, border collapses, fiscal instability, national security vulnerabilities. They claimed the filibuster allowed lawmakers to avoid accountability by hiding behind procedural barriers. But constitutional scholars sounded alarms. The more authority the executive branch accumulates, the more vulnerable the system becomes to future abuse. Trump might use expanded power to restore order. A future president could use the same authority for ideological overreach. That's the dilemma. The safeguards that slow reform also prevent excess. But to Trump, congressional dysfunction had reached catastrophic levels. The system, he argued, was broken beyond incremental fixes. America needed a structural reset. And while debates over legislative power dominated cable news, another issue emerged that carried even greater implications for the separation of powers: Trump's signals of potential military action in Venezuela. At a press conference that stunned even senior advisors, Trump confirmed his administration was weighing airstrikes against cartel infrastructure inside Venezuela: manufacturing hubs, transit routes, narcotics warehouses, not maritime interceptions, not surveillance missions, direct land strikes. Justification came from Article 2, the president's authority to act against imminent threats. The opioid and fentanyl epidemics, killing tens of thousands annually, were framed as national security emergencies originating from foreign criminal networks. Critics responded immediately, citing the War Powers Act. Bombing a sovereign nation, even one in collapse, constitutes military action requiring Congress's approval. But history complicates the argument. Presidents of both parties used executive military authority without congressional consent. Obama in Libya and Syria, Bush in multiple theaters post 9/11, even Trump himself in targeted operations during his first term. The difference? Airstrikes inside Venezuela risked igniting regional instability. Still, Trump argued Maduro's regime functioned as a cartel state, and treating it with diplomatic caution was foolish. Whether strategic or provocative, the move demonstrated Trump's belief that executive authority extends beyond domestic reform into global enforcement. While foreign policy headlines exploded, a quieter but equally explosive drama unfolded stateside. Special Counsel Jack Smith, the figure behind years of investigations targeting Trump, was subpoenaed by Congress. Lawmakers demanded clarity about his appointment, the origins of his authority, and whether the special counsel framework violated the Constitution. Legal scholars increasingly argue that special counsels exist in a gray zone. They wield extraordinary power, prosecutorial discretion, investigative reach, yet lack confirmation by the Senate or appointment by the president. In other words, they operate as powerful unelected officers without explicit constitutional legitimacy. A federal judge in Florida recently dismissed one of Smith's cases on those very grounds, ruling that the special counsel lacked lawful appointment authority. If that reasoning holds, the implications are seismic. Not only could investigations against Trump crumble, but the entire special counsel model could collapse. Trump seized on this momentum, arguing that the deep state built parallel legal systems to target political opponents while bypassing constitutional oversight. Whether one agrees or disagrees, the debate reflects a fundamental clash over who holds true authority inside the federal government. Now stack everything together: the judge removals, the creation of deportation courts, the snap oversight war, the fraud crackdowns, the push to eliminate the filibuster, the potential foreign strikes, the challenge to special counsel authority. At first glance, these might seem like disconnected actions, spontaneous fights unfolding across different arenas. But look closer. They all point to a single theme: the reassertion of executive authority after decades of bureaucratic drift. Trump believes the federal government is bloated, infiltrated by activists, crippled by indecision, and driven by interests that do not align with ordinary Americans. His response has been a coordinated campaign to restructure, repurpose, and redirect institutions that he argues have slipped out of democratic control. Whether history views this as necessary correction or dangerous expansion remains to be seen. But what's undeniable is that Trump's second-term agenda is not tinkering around the edges. It's rewriting the operating manual of the federal state. And that brings us to the moment we're living in right now. A moment bigger than judges, bigger than welfare audits, bigger than partisan fights. This is about the architecture of American power. Trump's actions represent a challenge to the way Washington has functioned for half a century. Supporters call it restoration. Opponents call it authoritarianism. But regardless of perspective, the pace and scope of change are unprecedented. A president is not simply reacting to crises. He's reshaping the machinery that processes those crises. He is confronting the systems, not the symptoms. And whether you agree with him or not, the impact is unmistakable. Agencies are being forced to justify their data. Courts are being rebuilt from the ground up. Welfare programs are being scrutinized. Congressional tools like the filibuster are being reconsidered. Foreign policy boundaries are being redrawn. Legal precedents surrounding special counsels are being tested. This isn't political theater, it's structural re-engineering. And in the coming months, these changes will determine not only how government operates, but who truly governs it. Trump's critics fear the transformation. His supporters say it's the only way to save the country. Either way, the nation is witnessing a historic shift in real time.